With me in studio are Andra Gillespie. She's a polling expert and associate professor at Emory University, and Cliff Albright. He's the co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund. Welcome to you both. Andra, let me start with you. And listen, I don't know that anybody expects these numbers to be the same in November of 2024, where the president and the former president are running even with men of color. But what do they mean now? What does this poll mean?
Well, it means a couple of things. One, the Biden campaign is looking at the sample size. It's also looking at people of color being grouped together. And it's important to keep in mind that while blacks are very, very Democratic, Latinos and Asian Americans are Democratic, but not as Democratic as that. What I think this suggests in the long term is that there's work to do. And so I expect that these numbers are going to stabilize. I expect that when the polls are looking at likely voters and not registered voters, we're going to see some, improvement for Biden. But if I were the Biden campaign, I would be more concerned about making sure that those Democratic voters who are going to vote for you turn out to vote, as I would be paying attention to what the horse race is.
Okay, so Cliff, let me come to you. You are working with voters, trying to get folks registered, protect their rights. What are you hearing about voters' thoughts on the administration and the president's work?
Yeah, I mean, there's some frustrations there, Victor. And I think, you've mentioned it, but I got to just reiterate, we're talking about a year out, right?
Yeah.
I don't have any confidence that the folks that were wrong about the red wave one day before the election can be right about this 1 year before the election, right? Second point is that we've heard these polls before. We were told Trump was going to get 20% of the black vote in 20. He didn't. We were told Herschel Walker was going to get 20% in Georgia. He didn't. We were told Daniel Cameron would get 20%. He certainly didn't. Right? And so we have to keep that in perspective. But thirdly, and more specifically to the point about black men, what we're hearing is that there are at least efforts from Republicans to communicate. A lot of it is disinformation, and they're trying to take advantage of gender differences. They're trying to cater to black men in terms of grievances. They're trying to talk about religious conservatism, some economic issues, not matched by policies, right? Just messaging that they are using disinformation to target. So the real question isn't so much why there's been a marginal change, it's why is it with that attention that they're paying and with that disinformation, it's actually amazing that there haven't been bigger changes in the way that black men are voting. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think that it will.
I mentioned Georgia. I mentioned Arizona as well. Where else could those votes be decisive in flipping a state one way or the other?
I think it's important to point out that particularly among black voters, that gender gap has been present. And so if you look at gender gaps that we think about broadly, they were actually bigger amongst blacks and Latinx folks in 2020. And it's actually pretty consistent that black men vote a little bit more Republican than black women do. What these numbers mean and what the turnout numbers mean, because I think turnout ultimately is more important here, is that in states where the margin is going to be 100,000 votes, like it could be in Pennsylvania, or the margin could be 50,000 votes or 10,000 votes, like it kind of was here in Georgia, that if you don't have people turning out, that could be the difference between winning and losing an election.
So when you say there are some issues, there are some concerns, what are you hearing, Cliff, from voters who, beyond what you say are coming from Republicans, what they think about the first couple of years of the Biden administration?
I mean, it's mixed reactions, right? You have some people that recognize that, honestly, in terms of legislation, this has actually been a historic administration, right? And on issues that directly affect black folks. And so there are a lot of black voters, because keep in mind, we're talking about the margins. Still, the vast majority are supportive. But there are some issues in terms of, and particularly with younger voters, that are frustrated about student debt cancellation, frustrated about voting rights, frustrated that there's not more action on gun violence. And right now, because one of these polls that we're talking about came out in these past 3-4 weeks, right in the middle of the Gaza conflict, there's a lot of particularly younger black voters that are very frustrated with the administration's response. I think you touched on it in your opening.
I think we need to pull that thread a bit more of the third option here between Trump and Biden is just staying home, right? And that could be an option that for people who don't think that the alternative is better, that just staying out of it potentially is what they choose.
Yeah, so I think particularly for Democratic-leaning voters, the Biden message has to be don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Part of it is addressing misinformation about who does what in government. So President Biden can try to unilaterally cancel student debt, but if the Supreme Court says he can't, then we've seen kind of separation of powers and checks and balances kind of get in the way. There are things that Congress has not passed. So the president can't implement what Congress doesn't actually put into law. And so there is a big big education process so that people can understand and are patient and then actually measure their expectations. But I think another thing that's also really important that I think a lot of young black people are saying here is they don't want to feel neglected by the Democratic Party because of the assumption that blacks are all Democratic, so therefore you don't have to do anything to earn their vote. So I think some of this is a battle cry and a clarion call for the Democrats to not ignore black communities and to campaign.
Cliff, is there a generational difference from what you're hearing that we talked about young black voters and young black male voters? Are you hearing something different from older voters than you are from the younger ones?
Definitely. There's definitely a generational difference. You've definitely got, older voters that, they're super voters. They're going to stay reliable Democratic voters. They're going to come out. But with younger voters, look, younger folks always talk about you got to have the receipts, right? Mm-hmm. You got to show the tangibles. And if they're not seeing it, like you said, not so much switching over to Trump because, not loving him or Republicans in general, but there is that option of staying home. There is that option, I think you talked about, these third-party candidates that are coming out. There is an option that people might, look at Cornel West.
Are you hearing people that are entertaining Cornel West or Kennedy or any of the others?
Definitely. And it's, again, it's not a huge amount, but you do have some people, and especially over the past 3-4 weeks, who are so upset about the president's response to Gaza that they're like, I will never vote for him again. We also have to keep in mind that really, the black enthusiasm for President Biden wasn't really there in 2020. He got a lot of the black vote, right? But black voters are very pragmatic. They recognize that he was the best option to beat Trump. Right? But it wasn't out of some deep affection, some deep connection, some deep enthusiasm. So some of what the polls are showing is that fundamental flaw that was there from the very beginning. So when we talk about the polls, what I always say to people is, look, the sky's not falling, right? Okay. But there are some issues. It just might be drizzling. And you've got to pay attention to that drizzle. You better go get an umbrella. You better start talking to folks more. You better start looking at some of these policies that, again, younger voters and some older black voters want to see.
That's important. It's drizzling. There is no downpour yet. Cliff,
Sure.
Andra, thank you so much.